Welcome to this lecture on inclusive fitness in animal behavior. Imagine you have a limited amount of food and you are incredibly hungry. If a complete stranger asked for it, you would probably say no. But if your younger sister or your child asked, you would likely share it without a second thought. Today, we are going to explore why we, along with countless other animals, naturally favor our family members over strangers, and how this invisible biological drive shapes the natural world. Now that we have introduced the idea of favoring family, let us look at the underlying biological drive. In the wild, an animal's ultimate goal is to pass on its genetic blueprint to the next generation. While having your own babies is the most obvious way to do this, it is not the only way. Because you share a large percentage of your genes with your relatives, helping them survive and reproduce achieves the exact same goal. This beautiful, hidden logic of nature forms the very foundation of what we call inclusive fitness. It explains why family bonds are so powerful across the animal kingdom. Building on this idea of shared genes, let us formally define inclusive fitness. In the scientific study of animal behavior, inclusive fitness is the total measure of an organism's evolutionary success in passing on its genes. It is calculated by adding together two distinct components. First, we have direct fitness, which is the traditional measure of success, achieved by producing your own offspring. Second, we have indirect fitness, which is the success an individual achieves by helping its genetic relatives survive and reproduce. Therefore, an animal does not necessarily need to have its own babies to be evolutionarily successful. To see how powerful indirect fitness can be, let us consider a classic example from nature. Think about a sterile worker bee. This bee will never have babies of her own, which means her direct fitness is zero. However, she spends her entire life helping her mother, the queen, raise thousands of sisters. Because she shares genes with all those sisters, that worker bee accumulates a massive amount of inclusive fitness. This concept completely revolutionized biology because it finally explained why animals sometimes sacrifice their own lives or reproductive chances for the benefit of others. This idea of sacrifice brings us to a major historical puzzle. Before the concept of inclusive fitness was introduced, Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection faced a massive, glaring problem. If evolution is all about the survival of the fittest, why do some animals act altruistically? Why would they sacrifice their own well-being or even their lives to help others? It seemed to contradict the very core of evolutionary theory. Inclusive fitness perfectly solves this mystery by showing that these seemingly selfless acts are actually genetically selfish. The animal is simply ensuring its shared genes survive. Let us look at a specific example of this genetic selfishness in action. Imagine a meerkat standing on a high rock, acting as a lookout. When it spots an eagle, it screams to warn the rest of the group. This is incredibly dangerous, as the loud call draws the eagle's deadly attention directly to the sentinel. Why take that risk? The meerkat is protecting its siblings and cousins. By risking its own life, it ensures that the genes they share are safely passed on to the next generation. Without inclusive fitness, complex social structures like this would be impossible to explain. Now that we understand the concept of altruism, let us look at the mathematics behind it. To understand exactly when an animal will choose to help a relative, we use a mathematical formula known as Hamilton's rule, formulated in the 1960s. The rule states that an altruistic behavior will only become common if the genetic benefit to the relatives heavily outweighs the personal cost to the helper. In this elegant inequality, R represents the coefficient of relatedness, which is the fraction of genes shared between the helper and the recipient. B represents the reproductive benefit to the recipient, measured in the number of extra offspring they can produce. Finally, C represents the reproductive cost to the actor, measured in lost offspring. If the relatedness or the benefit increases, the animal is much more likely to help. If the cost becomes too high, the animal will selfishly look out for itself. Before we move on, let us see this formula in action with a concrete example. Imagine a young female bird deciding whether to leave home and raise 2 of her own chicks or stay and help her mother raise 5 extra full siblings. We need to figure out which choice gives her the highest genetic payoff. First, we identify the relatedness. She shares 50% of her genes with her own chicks and 50% with her full siblings, so R is 0.5 in both cases. Next, we calculate the cost. By giving up 2 of her own chicks, she loses 2 times 0.5, which equals 1.0 gene equivalents. Then, we calculate the benefit. Helping raise 5 extra siblings gives 5 times 0.5, which equals 2.5 gene equivalents gained. Finally, we compare them. Since 2.5 is strictly greater than 1.0, Hamilton's rule is satisfied. Physically, this means evolution will strongly favor the bird acting as a babysitter. Let us apply this rule to a more complex scenario involving risk. Consider a ground squirrel that spots a coyote. If she gives an alarm call, she saves 4 nieces, but faces a 25% chance of being eaten before having her expected litter of 3 pups. Will she sound the alarm? First, we note the relatedness. She shares 25% of her genes with a niece and 50% with her own pups. To find the expected cost, we multiply her 25% chance of dying by the 3 pups she would have had, and then by the 0.5 relatedness. This gives a genetic cost of 0.375. For the benefit, saving 4 nieces multiplied by the 0.25 relatedness gives exactly 1.0 gene equivalents saved. Comparing the two, 1.0 is much greater than 0.375. Because the mathematical payoff of saving her nieces is higher, she will absolutely risk her life and sound the alarm. Now that we have calculated these values, let us visualize how these components come together. On screen, you are looking at a schematic diagram that breaks down inclusive fitness. On the left, we have an adult bird. Notice the 2 distinct pathways flowing from it. The top arrow represents direct fitness, pointing to the bird's own offspring, where the relatedness is 0.5. The bottom arrow represents indirect fitness, pointing to a niece or nephew, where the relatedness is 0.25. Both of these pathways converge into the large box on the right labeled Total Inclusive Fitness. This diagram beautifully illustrates that evolution does not care which path the genes take. Whether through direct reproduction or indirect helping, both contribute to the ultimate evolutionary success of the animal. This visual framework leads us to a profound realization about animal society. Hamilton's rule is not just a theoretical idea. It provides a strict mathematical condition that allows scientists to predict behavior. As we saw in the formula, if the relatedness between animals is high, or the benefit to the receiver is massive, helping behaviors become incredibly likely. Conversely, if the personal cost becomes too high, the inequality fails, and the animal will selfishly choose to look out for itself. By simply observing the family trees and survival rates in a population, biologists can mathematically predict whether animals will cooperate, fight, or sacrifice themselves. It turns the seemingly chaotic social lives of animals into a predictable, logical system. To wrap up our lecture, let us review the most important ideas we have covered. First, inclusive fitness completely changes how we view success in the animal kingdom, proving that evolution is about the survival of shared genetic codes, not just individual survival. Second, we learned that total fitness is the sum of direct personal reproduction and indirect helping of relatives. Finally, Hamilton's rule gives us the mathematical key to understanding altruism. Whenever you see an animal acting selflessly, remember that they are actually ensuring their family's genetic legacy lives on. You now have a comprehensive understanding of inclusive fitness and the hidden logic of animal behavior.